May 8, 1945. Camp Clarinda, Iowa. The morning air hung thick with silence as the commandant's boots echoed across the gravel courtyard. Before him stood rows of German women, their eyes downcast, hands clasped tight. He cleared his throat and spoke the words every prisoner dreams of hearing. The war is over. You can go home. But instead of celebration, tears began to fall. Instead of relief, a quiet sob broke the stillness. And in that moment, the American officers realized they were witnessing something no military manual had prepared them for. The women stood motionless, their faces pale beneath the Iowa sun. Some shook their heads slowly. Others whispered in German, voices trembling. A young Luftwaffe auxiliary, no older than 23, began to weep openly. An American lieutenant stepped forward, confused, repeating the announcement louder, as if volume might change meaning, but the resistance only deepened. These women, branded enemies, held behind barbed wire thousands of miles from home, did not want freedom. They wanted to stay. And as the officers exchanged bewildered glances, a chilling truth settled over the camp like frost. Captivity had become their only refuge from a world destroyed. The journey to that moment had begun years earlier, when the first German women crossed the Atlantic not as immigrants but as prisoners of war. They were auxiliaries, nurses, radio operators, clerks, women swept into the machinery of the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe, then swept into captivity when Allied forces overran North Africa, Italy, and France. Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as savages, brutes who would torture and starve their captives. The women expected cruelty. They prepared for suffering. But what awaited them in the heartland of America was something far stranger: abundance. The camps dotted the Midwest, like seeds scattered across farmland. Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma, Iowa. Wooden barracks rose from flat earth, surrounded by wire and watchtowers, yet inside them life unfolded with an order the women had not known in years. Meals arrived 3 times daily, sometimes totaling over 3,000 calories more than most German civilians had seen since 1942. White bread appeared on metal trays, soft and warm. Meat, once a memory, became routine. And peanut butter, that strange American obsession, became a symbol of the surreal new world they inhabited. Before we continue with this incredible story, if you're enjoying this deep dive into a forgotten chapter of World War II, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. And drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our global community of history lovers. One woman, a former typist from Stuttgart, scribbled in a battered notebook, "They feed us until we cannot eat more." I thought this was a trick, but the trick never ends. Her handwriting, thin and slanted, carried disbelief rather than gratitude, as though abundance itself were a weapon she could not comprehend. Another prisoner, standing in the mess hall staring at a tray piled with food, whispered to her neighbor, "In Hamburg, my mother boils nettles. Here, they throw away the crusts." The contrast haunted every moment. Back in Germany, cities burned beneath Allied bombs. Ration cards offered grams of bread, ounces of lard, nothing more. Children fainted in schoolyards. Elderly women froze in unheated apartments. The Reich, once promised to last 1,000 years, was collapsing into rubble and starvation. Yet here, behind enemy wire, the prisoners lived better than they had in their own country for half a decade. The irony was not lost on them, nor was it lost on the American guards who watched with growing unease as the women began to settle in, not with resignation, but with something closer to relief. Daily life took on rhythms that blurred the line between imprisonment and survival. In the mornings, the women rose to the clang of a bell, the smell of coffee drifting from the guards' quarters. They filed into work details, peeling potatoes in camp kitchens, scrubbing laundry in steaming tubs, marching under armed escort into fields of corn and sugar beets. The work was hard, the sun fierce, but it was work that fed them, clothed them, gave them purpose. On Kansas farms, local families watched from porches, wary at first, expecting sabotage or defiance. Instead, they saw women laughing, joking in broken English, bending over rows of crops with the kind of dedication born not from duty, but from gratitude. One farmer told a guard, half in jest, half in earnest, "If they keep working like this, I'll hire them after the war." The guard laughed, but the comment stuck. These were not the fanatics of Nazi propaganda. They were exhausted women who had found, against all odds, a place where they could breathe again. Music became the thread that stitched together their fragile community. At night, after the work was done and the barracks doors closed, someone would pull out an accordion smuggled from Europe. Folk songs rose into the prairie darkness, melodies carried on the wind across endless fields. Guards paused in their patrols to listen, the mournful tunes drifting through the wire like prayers. One sergeant admitted later, "I forgot they were the enemy. They sounded like my grandmother singing in the kitchen." But beneath the music, beneath the laughter and the work, shadows grew longer with each letter from home. The mail arrived in thin envelopes, censored and delayed, bearing news that stripped away any illusion of return. Hamburg was ash, Dresden smoldered. Cologne stood as a forest of chimneys, its streets unrecognizable. Families had vanished into the chaos of war's end. Fathers were missing in Russia. Brothers lay in unmarked graves. And mothers, those who still lived, wrote in shaking script of hunger so deep that death seemed close. One prisoner, a 26-year-old named Hannelore, read aloud to her bunkmates a letter from her mother in Hanover. "Your sister is gone. Your father we do not speak of. I sleep in the cellar because the roof has holes. If you return, I do not know where you will sleep or what you will eat." The paper trembled in her hands. The barracks fell silent. Another woman's voice cracked as she whispered, "My village does not exist anymore. It is Soviet now. I have no home." The realization spread through the camps like a slow poison. Going home no longer meant reunion. It meant stepping into ruins, begging for scraps, wandering among the rubble of a country that had ceased to exist. The Germany they remembered, the towns, the streets, the kitchens where mothers cooked, the churches where families gathered, was gone. In its place stood occupation zones carved by foreign powers, cities without roofs, populations without hope. And so, when the announcement came in May 1945, the words "you can go home" landed not as liberation but as exile. The officers expected joy. They expected gratitude. Instead, they encountered resistance so quiet, so profound, it unsettled them more than any act of defiance. A captain in Texas recalled, "I thought they would run to the gate. Instead, they stood there, frozen, as if I'd just sentenced them to death." In the weeks that followed, petitions began to appear. Handwritten notes in careful English, asking, begging to remain. Some women offered to work as nurses in American hospitals. Others volunteered to clean, to cook, to scrub floors for the rest of their lives if it meant they could stay. A few, desperate and naive, asked if they might marry their way into America, though regulations made such dreams impossible. The requests piled up on officers' desks, each one a small, heartbreaking testament to the depth of devastation across the Atlantic. One woman in Iowa handed a note to a guard. It read, "Please, let me stay. There is nothing in Germany but ghosts." The guard, a 19-year-old farm boy from Illinois, later wrote to his mother, "I never thought the enemy would ask me to keep them prisoners, but some of them cry when they think of going back. They say they are safer here than free out there. I don't know what to tell them." The irony cut deep. America, painted by Nazi propaganda as a nation of monsters, had become the only place where these women felt human. The camps, designed to confine, had become sanctuaries. The barbed wire, meant to divide, had become a shield. And the officers, trained to view prisoners as adversaries, found themselves face to face with women who feared their own homeland more than enemy captivity. The fear was not abstract. Reports filtered in from the Soviet zone, whispers of mass reprisals, women dragged from cellars, entire villages emptied in the night. Even the western zones, under British and American control, offered little comfort. Food shortages were chronic. Cities were skeletal. Millions wandered as displaced persons, clutching identity papers that meant nothing in a world without borders or mercy. To leave the camp in Iowa for Bremen or Frankfurt was not liberation. It was a leap into the abyss. A young woman named Liesel, once a secretary in Bremen, told her bunkmate, "I would rather scrub floors in Texas for the rest of my life than risk a single night in the Soviet zone." Her words echoed through the barracks, a vow spoken by many, though all knew it was one they could not keep. The trains arrived in the summer of 1946, their iron wheels glinting beneath the prairie sun. The machinery of repatriation moved with bureaucratic precision, indifferent to pleas or tears. The Geneva Convention was clear. Prisoners must be returned. America had no intention of keeping them, least of all women, any longer than necessary. Orders were orders. Duty was duty. And so the gates, once locked to keep them in, now opened to push them out. The women packed what little they owned, scarves knitted in captivity, photographs of guards' children given in kindness, notebooks filled with diary entries about soap and corn and music. Each item felt heavier than the suitcase that carried it, because each one represented a life about to vanish. As they climbed aboard the trains, some wept openly. Others stared in silence at the receding wire, their last anchor disappearing into the distance. One guard stood on the platform, watching the train pull away. He later wrote, "I thought prisons were supposed to hold people against their will, but these prisoners held on to the prison. They looked back like they were leaving home, not returning to it. The ships carried them across the Atlantic to Bremerhaven and Hamburg, where great docks awaited, crowded with strangers holding slips of paper, searching for names. The women stepped off the gangplanks and were swallowed by a homeland unrecognizable, its streets blackened, its houses roofless, its people gaunt. Those who had begged to remain in America found their worst fears confirmed. There was no home, only ruins. Yet captivity had marked them in ways that endured. Some women, once resettled, dreamed of returning not to the barbed wire, but to the country that had surprised them with kindness. In the 1950s, when immigration to the United States became possible again, a handful of former prisoners applied eagerly. Some succeeded, crossing the ocean once more, this time not as captives but as immigrants, seeking the land where they had first tasted survival. For those who remained in Germany, captivity lived on in memory, as a season both bitter and strangely sweet. They recalled the shame of defeat, the humiliation of being guarded, but also the shocking generosity of meals too plentiful to finish, the laughter over clumsy English phrases, the late-night songs that rose into the prairie air. These contradictions did not cancel each other out. They coexisted, shaping a generation of women who learned that freedom was not always simple, and captivity not always cruel. The Americans, too, were changed. Guards who had once feared or despised their prisoners carried home stories of women who cried at the thought of leaving. One sergeant told his children decades later, "I saw the enemy ask to stay my prisoner. That's when I understood how broken their world was." For him, the memory was not of triumph, but of tragedy, the sight of young women holding onto prison fences as though they were lifelines. The story is filled with irony too sharp to ignore. Officers who believed in freedom as a gift were forced to watch their prisoners recoil from it. German women who had once lived under a regime that promised 1,000 years of glory now clung to the daily mercy of a foreign enemy. Freedom meant hunger. Captivity meant survival. History delights in paradox, but few paradoxes cut as deep as this one. And so the narrative circles back to those words spoken in May 1945. You can go home. They were meant to open a door. Yet for many, they sounded like a sentence. The gates stood open, but the women looked back. Eyes turned not east toward Europe, but west toward the horizon, the land they could not claim, yet could not forget. Their loyalty to captivity was, in truth, loyalty to life itself. It is a reminder that freedom is never merely the absence of chains, but the presence of dignity, safety, and hope. And as the last trains departed and the camps emptied, one question lingered in the air like smoke over a battlefield. What does home truly mean to those who no longer recognize it? The women knew the answer. Home was not a place. It was the memory of feeling human again. And for a brief paradoxical moment in history, that memory was born behind barbed wire on foreign soil in the heart of the enemy's land.